The gavel comes down with a sharp crack that echoes through the federal courthouse. Judge Thaddeus Whitmore, a man whose silver hair and expensive robes radiate old money authority, looks down with undisguised contempt at the black woman standing before his bench. Miss, what is it again? Some urban name I can't be expected to pronounce. Victoria Sterling keeps her voice steady, professional. Sterling, Your Honor. Victoria Sterling. Sterling. How aspirational. Well, Miss Sterling, I see from your paperwork that you're representing yourself today. How refreshing. Another defendant who thinks watching Law and Order qualifies her as an attorney. The courtroom gallery snickers. The prosecutor grins. The court clerk shuffles papers with practiced indifference. What none of them know is that the woman they're dismissing has been planning this moment for 6 months. The badge and credentials hidden in her briefcase tell a very different story than what appears on the surface. Victoria Sterling isn't what she seems, and Judge Whitmore is about to learn that some underestimations carry a very heavy price. I suppose you have some sort of defense prepared. Please tell me you're not going to waste this court's valuable time with YouTube legal theories. Victoria reaches for her leather folder, her movements deliberate and calm. Inside are documents that will change everything, but not yet. First, she needs to let them reveal exactly who they really are. I have several motions to present, Your Honor. Motions. Of course you do. The lock clicks twice on her briefcase, then silence. The morning had begun 3 hours earlier when Victoria Sterling entered the Charleston County Federal Courthouse through the main entrance at exactly 7:30 a.m. Her movements carried the precision of someone accustomed to early mornings and structured routines, though to casual observers she appeared to be just another nervous defendant arriving early for her court date. She wore a simple navy blazer over a white blouse, her hair pulled back in a professional bun that somehow managed to look both respectful and understated. The security checkpoint provided the first test of the day. As Victoria placed her belongings in the plastic bin, the security guard, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a badge reading Officer Martinez, gave her an extra long look. First time in federal court? He asked, his tone suggesting this wasn't really a question. Yes, Victoria replied quietly, retrieving her items from the conveyor belt. Martinez gestured for her to step through the metal detector, which immediately began beeping despite her having removed all metal objects. Step back, miss. Arms up. Victoria complied without protest as Martinez ran the hand wand over her frame with unnecessary thoroughness. The detector remained silent, but Martinez shook his head dramatically. Machine's being touchy today. Better check again. This was microaggression number 1, the kind of extra scrutiny that happened to people who look like Victoria in places like this courthouse. But she simply stood patiently, her hands at her sides, making mental notes of the timestamps and witnesses present. No complaints, no protests, just quiet observation that spoke to a deeper understanding of how systems worked. After the third unnecessary scan, Martinez finally waved her through. Try to stay out of more trouble after today. Victoria's response was a simple nod of acknowledgement. She gathered her briefcase and folder, organized them with the kind of military precision that might have seemed odd for someone supposedly struggling with criminal charges, and made her way toward the courtroom elevators. The courthouse itself was a study in intimidation architecture. Marble floors that echoed every footstep, impossibly high ceilings that made individuals feel small, and portraits of stern-faced judges from decades past whose eyes seemed to follow visitors with judgment. Victoria moved through this space like someone who belonged, her posture straight and confident despite her supposed status as a defendant facing serious federal charges. On the 3rd floor, she found Courtroom C, where Judge Thaddeus Whitmore presided over federal criminal cases. The hallway outside buzzed with the familiar energy of a courthouse morning. Attorneys wheeling briefcases full of files, court reporters setting up equipment, and various officials moving with the practiced efficiency of people who knew their roles in the judicial theater. Victoria chose a bench across from the courtroom and opened her briefcase. The contents were organized with remarkable precision. Files arranged by tabs, documents in protective sleeves, and everything time-stamped and cross-referenced. For someone supposedly handling her first self-representation case, her organizational system appeared surprisingly sophisticated. "Excuse me, are you waiting for Judge Whitmore's court?" The voice belonged to a young woman in a rumpled suit carrying an overstuffed bag that looked ready to burst. Her name tag identified her as Assistant Public Defender Sarah Martinez, and she had the harried look of someone juggling too many cases with too few resources. "Yes," Victoria replied. 9 o'clock hearing. "Are you sure you don't want representation? I mean, I know the public defender's office is swamped, but self-repping in Whitmore's court is..." Sarah paused, clearly searching for diplomatic language. It's challenging. Victoria turned slightly to study the young attorney. Sarah Martinez was clearly well-intentioned, but the exhaustion in her eyes told a story of a system that chewed up idealistic lawyers and spit them out. What makes Judge Whitmore's court different? Sarah glanced around the hallway before lowering her voice. He's not particularly patient with defendants who don't know legal procedure inside and out. I've seen him add time to sentences just for addressing him incorrectly. And if you're representing yourself, she shook her head. He takes that as a personal insult to the legal profession. What would you recommend? Victoria asked, her tone suggesting genuine interest in the advice. Honestly, accept whatever plea deal they're offering. Whitmore's sentences after trial are brutal, especially for defendants who represent themselves. He sees self-representation as showing disrespect to the court. Victoria nodded thoughtfully, filing away this intelligence about the judge's predispositions. Thank you for the warning. I appreciate it. Sarah stood to leave but paused. What are you charged with, if you don't mind me asking? Federal civil rights violations. 18 U.S.C. Section 242. The public defender's eyebrows rose. Civil rights charges under Section 242 were serious federal offenses, typically involving law enforcement misconduct or systematic constitutional violations. They weren't the kind of charges someone faced without having done something that attracted significant federal attention. That's serious territory. Are you sure you don't want to at least consult with someone who specializes in federal criminal defense? I'm confident in my preparation, Victoria said calmly, but thank you for your concern. Sarah Martinez walked away shaking her head, muttering something about people not understanding what they were up against. But Victoria had understood exactly what she was up against for months. That was the point. At 8:45 a.m., the courtroom doors opened and court personnel began filing in. Victoria gathered her materials and joined the small group waiting to enter. The bailiff, a stern-faced man whose uniform strained against his considerable bulk, checked names against his list. Sterling Victoria, self-representing defendant in case number 24-CR-1147. Present, Victoria replied. The bailiff looked her up and down with undisguised skepticism. Judge Whitmore doesn't much care for self-reps. Keep your mouth shut unless he asks you a direct question, understand? Victoria nodded and proceeded into the courtroom. The space was designed to intimidate. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and an elevated bench that positioned the judge as the ultimate authority figure. The American flag stood to one side, the state flag to the other, and the judicial seal dominated the wall behind the bench. Victoria took a seat in the defendant's section, noting the strategic positioning of every element in the room. The prosecutor's table was closer to the judge's bench. The jury box, though empty today, was positioned to give jurors clear sightlines to the judge's reactions. Even the gallery seating was arranged to emphasize the hierarchical nature of the proceedings. Other defendants and their attorneys filled the remaining seats, creating a low murmur of nervous conversation. Victoria remained silent, organizing her files with the same methodical precision she'd displayed earlier. A casual observer might have attributed this to nervousness, but her movement suggested something else entirely, the calm preparation of someone who knew exactly what was coming. If you're already feeling the injustice in this courtroom, wait until you see what she's really capable of. This woman has been planning something for months, and the judge has no idea what's coming. Hit that like button if you want to see karma served ice cold. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the bailiff called the courtroom to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Thaddeus Whitmore. The judge entered through a door behind the bench, his black robes flowing dramatically as he climbed the steps to his elevated position. Whitmore was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair perfectly styled and a face that suggested he'd never encountered a hardship he couldn't buy his way out of. His pale blue eyes swept the courtroom with the confidence of someone who'd never had his authority seriously challenged. "Be seated," he commanded, settling into his high-backed leather chair. "We have a full docket today, so let's proceed efficiently." The first few cases were routine: plea agreements, sentencing continuances, and bail hearings that proceeded with mechanical precision. Victoria observed the rhythm of the court, noting how Whitmore's demeanor shifted depending on the defendant's race and apparent economic status. White defendants received patient explanations of their rights. Black and Latino defendants got clipped, dismissive interactions that bordered on hostile. When a young black man appeared without counsel, asking for a continuance to find an attorney, Whitmore's response was swift and harsh. "Mr. Johnson, this court operates on a schedule. Your failure to secure representation demonstrates a lack of respect for judicial proceedings. We'll proceed with arraignment." The man's public defender, clearly unprepared, stumbled through a basic plea colloquy while Whitmore drummed his fingers impatiently on the bench. The message was clear. Efficiency mattered more than fairness, and defendants who couldn't navigate the system smoothly would be steamrolled. At 9:45 a.m., the clerk called Victoria's case. Case number 24-CR-1147, United States v. Victoria Sterling. Defendant appearing pro se. Victoria stood and approached the podium positioned between the prosecution and defense tables. The prosecutor, a thin man in his 30s wearing an expensive suit and an expression of barely concealed smugness, looked up from his files with obvious amusement. His nameplate read, Assistant District Attorney Harrison Blackwell. Judge Whitmore looked down at Victoria with the same expression he might wear while examining something unpleasant on his shoe. Miss, what is it again? Some urban name I can't be expected to pronounce? Sterling, Your Honor. Victoria Sterling. Sterling. How aspirational. His tone suggested he found the name presumptuous, as if she were attempting to claim a status she hadn't earned. Well, Miss Sterling, I see from your paperwork that you're representing yourself today. How refreshing. Another defendant who thinks watching Law & Order qualifies her as an attorney. The gallery behind Victoria tittered with nervous laughter, the kind that people produced when they wanted to align themselves with power. Prosecutor Blackwell smirked openly. The court clerk, a middle-aged black woman whose nameplate read Magnolia Hayes, avoided eye contact while shuffling through papers with obvious discomfort. Victoria maintained her composure, her voice level and professional. I understand the court's concern about self-representation, Your Honor. I'm prepared to proceed according to proper legal procedure. Whitmore barely glanced at his file before responding. Oh, I'm sure you are. Let me guess. You've been watching YouTube videos about constitutional rights? Reading Wikipedia articles about federal criminal law? He leaned back in his chair, clearly preparing to enjoy what he expected would be an amusing display of legal incompetence. By all means, Miss Sterling, enlighten us with your understanding of federal criminal procedure. Your Honor, I'd like to address several procedural matters before we proceed with arraignment. I have motions regarding discovery timelines, evidence authentication, and constitutional protections that apply to this case. Motions? Of course you do. Whitmore's voice dripped with condescension. Miss Sterling, let me save you some time. This court has been operating federal criminal proceedings for 23 years. I think I understand proper procedure without instruction from someone whose legal education comes from daytime television. Victoria reached for her leather folder, her movements deliberate and calm. Your Honor, I've prepared these motions according to federal rules of criminal procedure. I believe the court will find them properly formatted and legally grounded. Well, isn't that special? Whitmore said, his voice carrying enough mockery to draw more nervous laughter from the gallery. A defendant who believes she understands federal rules better than federal judges. This should be entertaining. The exchange was being observed by court personnel, attorneys in the gallery, and a few members of the press who covered federal criminal proceedings. Victoria's calm professionalism in the face of obvious judicial hostility was beginning to create an atmosphere of uncomfortable tension. Court clerk Magnolia Hayes looked up from her computer screen with an expression that might have been sympathy but quickly returned her attention to her paperwork when Judge Whitmore's gaze swept in her direction. Miss Sterling, Whitmore continued, perhaps before we indulge your legal theories, you could explain to this court how someone with your background came to believe she could handle complex federal criminal charges without proper legal representation. The question was loaded with implications about race, class, and education that hung in the courtroom like smoke. Victoria's response would be noted and remembered by everyone present. Your Honor, I believe every defendant has the constitutional right to self-representation, regardless of their background. I've prepared extensively for these proceedings and believe I can provide effective advocacy for my case. Effective advocacy, Whitmore repeated slowly, savoring the words, from someone who probably learned about the Constitution from social media posts. Miss Sterling, do you have any idea what federal civil rights violations actually entail? Any understanding of the penalties you're facing if convicted? Victoria's posture remained straight, her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. Violations under 18 U.S.C. Section 242 carry potential penalties, including substantial fines and federal imprisonment. I understand the seriousness of these charges. Whitmore paused, clearly not expecting such a precise response. Victoria's citation of specific federal statutes suggested she possessed more legal knowledge than he'd anticipated from someone he'd been prepared to dismiss as an incompetent defendant. Well, he said slowly, perhaps you're not completely ignorant of basic legal concepts. But understanding statutes and navigating federal criminal procedure are entirely different matters. Are you prepared to proceed with arraignment, or do you need time to reconsider your foolish decision to represent yourself? Victoria consulted her organized files with clinical precision. Your Honor, before proceeding with arraignment, I'd like the court to address several preliminary matters that affect my constitutional rights in this case. Prosecutor Blackwell finally spoke up, his voice carrying an undertone of amusement. Your Honor, perhaps we could expedite these proceedings. The prosecution is prepared to offer a reasonable plea agreement that would spare Miss Sterling the embarrassment of attempting to conduct her own defense. Victoria turned toward Blackwell with an expression of polite interest. Mr. Blackwell, I appreciate the prosecution's concern for my embarrassment, but I prefer to exercise my constitutional right to examine the evidence against me before considering any plea agreements. The response was delivered so calmly that it took several seconds for its full implications to register. Victoria Sterling had just politely declined a plea offer while suggesting that she intended to conduct a thorough examination of prosecutorial evidence, something that required substantial legal sophistication. Miss Sterling, Judge Whitmore said carefully, evidence examination involves complex procedural requirements that trained attorneys sometimes struggle to navigate properly. Are you certain you understand what you're requesting? Your Honor, I'm requesting discovery materials as provided under Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure Rule 16, along with authentication documentation for any physical evidence the prosecution intends to present at trial. Victoria's citation of specific federal rules delivered matter-of-factly created a moment of silence in the courtroom. Her legal language was too precise, too confident for someone supposedly learning law from television shows. Prosecutor Blackwell glanced at his files with an expression that might have been concern. Your Honor, the prosecution has prepared standard discovery materials according to federal requirements. However, if Miss Sterling is requesting extensive evidence authentication, perhaps she could specify her particular areas of concern? Victoria opened her folder and retrieved a document that appeared to be professionally prepared. Mr. Blackwell, I'd like authentication documentation for evidence items collected between October 1st and October 15th. Particularly regarding chain of custody protocols and federal evidence handling compliance. The specificity of her request sent a clear signal through the courtroom. Victoria Sterling wasn't making general requests for discovery materials. She was asking for specific evidence documentation that suggested detailed knowledge of her case and federal evidence protocols. Judge Whitmore was beginning to realize that what had started as an amusing exercise in watching an incompetent defendant embarrass herself was becoming something far more complex. Victoria Sterling clearly possessed legal knowledge that went well beyond what any reasonable self-representing defendant should have. Miss Sterling, he said slowly, where exactly did you acquire knowledge of federal evidence protocols? Victoria paused, maintaining eye contact with the judge. Your Honor, I've had occasion to study federal criminal procedure through various educational resources. The federal rules are publicly available documents. It was a technically true answer that revealed nothing while highlighting the assumptions underlying the judge's questions. Victoria Sterling was walking a careful line between honesty and operational security, providing answers that satisfied legal requirements without compromising her actual identity. The first motion Victoria presented was a request for complete discovery materials under Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure Rule 16, including all evidence collected, witness statements, and federal agency communications related to her case. Your Honor, Victoria began, consulting her professionally organized notes, I move for comprehensive discovery under Rule 16, subsection A, including all materials in the prosecution's possession or control. Judge Whitmore looked down with barely concealed irritation. Miss Sterling, standard discovery has already been provided according to federal requirements. Your fishing expedition for additional materials is denied. Victoria opened her folder and retrieved a copy of the federal rules, marked with numerous tabs and annotations that suggested extensive study. Your Honor, Rule 16 specifically requires disclosure of all evidence the government intends to use in its case in chief, as well as exculpatory evidence under Brady v. Maryland. The prosecution has provided only preliminary materials. The courtroom fell silent. Victoria had just cited both specific federal procedure and landmark Supreme Court precedent with the precision of an experienced federal criminal attorney. For someone supposedly learning law from television, her command of legal doctrine was remarkably sophisticated. Judge Whitmore's expression shifted from amused condescension to genuine irritation. Miss Sterling, are you attempting to lecture this court on Supreme Court precedent? No, Your Honor, I'm requesting that the court ensure full compliance with constitutional discovery requirements as established by the Supreme Court and codified in federal rules. Prosecutor Blackwell stood up, clearly sensing that this was not proceeding according to his expectations. Your Honor, the prosecution has complied with all discovery obligations. Ms. Sterling's requests appear designed to delay proceedings rather than facilitate legitimate preparation. Victoria turned toward Blackwell, her voice remaining calm and professional. Mr. Mupinasai. Blackwell, could you specify whether your discovery production included all federal agency communications regarding this case? I want to ensure compliance with Brady obligations for potentially exculpatory material. Blackwell blinked, clearly not expecting to be questioned about federal agency communications. The prosecution has provided all relevant materials according to standard protocols. Which federal agencies have communicated with the prosecution regarding this case? Victoria pressed gently. The question created immediate tension in the courtroom. Federal civil rights cases often involved multiple federal agencies: FBI, Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, U.S. Attorney's offices, and failure to disclose agency communications could constitute Brady violations that would result in case dismissal. Blackwell glanced toward Judge Whitmore, obviously seeking rescue from questions he couldn't answer confidently. Your Honor, federal agency coordination is standard in civil rights cases. All relevant communications have been properly disclosed. Victoria consulted her notes with clinical precision. Mr. Blackwell, could you identify which specific federal agencies have provided input on this prosecution? I'd like to ensure that all Brady material from all agencies has been properly reviewed and disclosed. Judge Whitmore intervened before Blackwell could respond further. Ms. Sterling, federal agency coordination is a prosecutorial function that doesn't require detailed disclosure to defendants beyond constitutional requirements. Your Honor, respectfully, Brady v. Maryland requires disclosure of all exculpatory evidence in government possession, regardless of which agency possesses it. If multiple federal agencies have been involved in this case, Brady obligations extend to all agency materials. Victoria's citation of Brady doctrine was delivered with the confidence of someone who understood its implications thoroughly. Brady violations were serious constitutional errors that could result in case dismissal and prosecutorial sanctions. Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes suddenly became very interested in her computer screen, typing rapidly despite no apparent input being required. Her body language suggested she knew something about federal agency involvement that was making her uncomfortable. Miss Sterling, Judge Whitmore said carefully, Brady obligations are well understood by this court and prosecution. Your concerns about disclosure completeness are noted for the record. Victoria reached into her briefcase and retrieved a thick folder marked with what appeared to be federal evidence seals. Your Honor, I have reason to believe that federal agency communications exist regarding this case that have not been disclosed in standard discovery materials. The presence of federal evidence seals on Victoria's documentation sent a shock through the courtroom. Such seals were typically available only to federal law enforcement agencies or attorneys with specific federal authorization. How a self-representing defendant had obtained federally sealed documents was a question that demanded immediate answers. Prosecutor Blackwell looked genuinely alarmed. Your Honor, the defense's possession of sealed federal documents raises serious questions about proper legal channels. Perhaps the court should investigate how Miss Sterling obtained materials that appear to exceed her authorization level. Victoria's response was delivered with unflappable calm. Mr. Blackwell, all documentation in my possession was obtained through proper legal channels available to criminal defendants. If you're questioning my access to these materials, perhaps you should specify which federal authority restricted defendant access to evidence in their own case. The exchange was becoming a legal chess match that was clearly beyond the scope of routine criminal proceedings. Victoria Sterling was demonstrating knowledge of federal procedure that rivaled experienced federal prosecutors, while simultaneously questioning the basic competence of the prosecution. Judge Whitmore realized that allowing this exchange to continue would only highlight the growing disparity between Victoria's legal sophistication and her supposed status as an untrained defendant. He needed to regain control before the situation developed beyond his ability to manage. Ms. Sterling, the court appreciates your attention to procedural detail, but these hearings must proceed according to established schedule. Your motion regarding additional discovery is denied. Do you have other matters that require judicial attention? Victoria consulted her notes again, her organization suggesting extensive preparation that extended far beyond what any reasonable defendant could accomplish without professional legal assistance. Yes, Your Honor. I move to dismiss all charges under Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, Rule 12, Subsection B, Paragraph 3, based on prosecutorial vindictiveness and selective enforcement. The motion hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Prosecutorial vindictiveness and selective enforcement were serious constitutional claims that could result in case dismissal if proven. Making such allegations required substantial legal knowledge and evidence of prosecutorial misconduct. Blackwell jumped to his feet immediately. Your Honor, the defense's allegations are baseless and inflammatory. The prosecution has followed all proper procedures in bringing these charges. Victoria opened her folder and retrieved documents that appeared to be statistical analyses and case comparisons. Your Honor, I have compiled data regarding prosecutorial charging patterns in this jurisdiction over the past 5 years, specifically relating to civil rights cases involving defendants of different racial backgrounds. Judge Whitmore's face went pale. Statistical evidence of racial disparities in prosecutorial charging could support selective enforcement claims under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Such evidence, if properly presented, could potentially invalidate not just Victoria's case, but call into question the legitimacy of the entire prosecutorial system in his jurisdiction. Ms. Sterling, where exactly did you obtain statistical data regarding federal prosecutorial patterns? Victoria's response was delivered with matter-of-fact professionalism. Your Honor, federal prosecutorial statistics are publicly available through Department of Justice reporting requirements and Freedom of Information Act requests. I conducted a comprehensive analysis of publicly available data. The sophistication required to conduct meaningful statistical analysis of federal prosecutorial patterns was far beyond what any self-representing defendant could reasonably accomplish. Victoria Sterling was demonstrating expertise that suggested professional training in both legal research and statistical methodology. Prosecutor Blackwell looked increasingly desperate. Your Honor, even if such statistics exist, they don't demonstrate prosecutorial vindictiveness in this specific case. The defense would need to prove intent to discriminate based on race, which requires evidence of prosecutorial motive that simply doesn't exist. Victoria turned toward Blackwell with an expression of polite interest. Mr. Blackwell, are you suggesting that statistical evidence of racial disparities in federal prosecutions is insufficient to support selective enforcement claims? I'd be interested in your legal authority for that position, given Supreme Court precedent in Yick-Wo v. Hopkins. The citation of Yick-Wo v. Hopkins, a landmark Supreme Court case establishing that statistical evidence can prove discriminatory enforcement, demonstrated yet another dimension of Victoria's legal knowledge. She was citing 100-year-old precedent that remained current law for equal protection analysis. Judge Whitmore was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the mounting evidence that Victoria Sterling possessed legal knowledge that far exceeded reasonable expectations. Her questions were too precise, her citations too accurate, and her strategic thinking too sophisticated. Ms. Sterling, this court is curious about the extent of your legal education. Your familiarity with constitutional precedent suggests training that goes beyond self-help legal resources. Victoria paused as if carefully considering her response. Your Honor, I've had extensive opportunity to study federal constitutional law through various educational experiences. Some education occurs outside traditional academic settings. It was another carefully crafted answer that revealed nothing while highlighting the assumptions underlying the judge's questions. Victoria Sterling was maintaining operational security while demonstrating that she understood exactly what information was being sought and why. Speaking of legal procedures, have you ever wondered how attorneys keep track of all those case files and deadlines? That's where Legal Flow Pro comes in. This revolutionary legal management software helps law firms organize evidence, track court dates, and never miss crucial deadlines. With features like automated document review and case timeline tracking, Legal Flow Pro is trusted by over 10,000 legal professionals nationwide. Visit LegalFlowPro.com and use code JUSTICE20 for 20% off your first year. Because in law, organization can mean the difference between winning and losing. The next escalation came when Bailiff Camden Pierce approached the bench with a folded message. Judge Whitmore read it quickly, his expression growing visibly more serious. Ms. Sterling, I've just received communication from the U.S. Marshals Service regarding security protocols for these proceedings. Apparently, your case has attracted federal attention that requires enhanced courtroom security measures. Victoria's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, a change so subtle that only someone trained in observation would have noticed. Your Honor, could you specify which federal authorities have requested security enhancement? The U.S. Marshals Service has recommended additional security protocols given the nature of your allegations and potential federal law enforcement implications. The presence of federal marshal attention meant that this case had escalated well beyond routine civil rights violations. Federal marshals typically became involved only when cases involved serious federal crimes. threats to federal personnel, or major federal law enforcement operations. Prosecutor Blackwell looked genuinely surprised by this development, suggesting that federal marshal involvement had occurred without his knowledge or coordination. His lack of awareness about federal security protocols indicated that control of this case was shifting away from local prosecutorial authority. "Your Honor," Victoria said calmly, "I appreciate federal security attention, but I want to ensure that enhanced protocols don't interfere with my constitutional right to effective self-representation and access to evidence." Judge Whitmore paused, clearly weighing his response carefully. Federal marshal security protocols operated under their own authority structure, which could supersede local judicial control over courtroom proceedings. "Ms. Sterling, federal security protocols will be implemented as deemed necessary by federal authorities. This court will coordinate with federal agencies to ensure constitutional protections while maintaining appropriate security measures." Victoria nodded professionally, but her response carried an undertone of sophisticated legal understanding. "Thank you, Your Honor. I assume federal coordination will include proper notification procedures under Rule 43 regarding any security measures that might affect defendant rights during proceedings." The citation of Rule 43 demonstrated yet another facet of Victoria's legal knowledge. Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure Rule 43 governed defendant presence and participation requirements, and its application to security situations required detailed understanding of federal criminal law. Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes suddenly looked up from her computer screen with obvious anxiety. "Your Honor, I've just received notification that federal authorities need to conduct an immediate security assessment of this courtroom and all case materials." Her announcement was highly irregular. Court clerks typically didn't interrupt proceedings to announce security requirements, particularly federal security assessments that hadn't been officially coordinated through judicial channels. Judge Whitmore shot Hayes a sharp look. "Mrs. Hayes, security coordination procedures are determined by this court in consultation with appropriate federal agencies. Clerk announcements of security requirements are not proper courtroom procedure." "Yes, Your Honor," Hayes replied quickly, but her nervousness was obvious. "I simply thought the court should be aware of federal coordination requirements that might affect these proceedings." Victoria observed this exchange with close attention, recognizing that Magnolia Hayes was exhibiting behavior suggesting she possessed information about federal activities that extended beyond normal court administrative functions. "Your Honor, Mina," Victoria interjected. "Perhaps Mrs. Hayes could clarify the source of federal security notifications she's receiving? Proper constitutional protection might require understanding official federal communication channels." Judge Whitmore looked at Victoria with obvious displeasure. "Ms. Sterling, court administrative procedures are within judicial discretion. Your input regarding clerk responsibilities is not required." "Of course, Your Honor. I simply want to ensure that all federal coordination complies with constitutional requirements for defendant notification and participation in proceedings that affect their rights." Victoria's response was delivered with perfect deference, but its effect was to emphasize that federal coordination had constitutional implications that could affect the validity of the entire proceeding. Any irregularities in federal coordination could potentially compromise the constitutional legitimacy of her prosecution. The tension in the courtroom was becoming palpable. Attorneys in the gallery had stopped their sidebar conversations to focus entirely on these proceedings. Court reporter Jennifer Walsh was typing rapidly, recognizing that this hearing was producing material that would likely be scrutinized by federal authorities. Prosecutor Blackwell stood up again, clearly recognizing that each development was exposing his lack of knowledge about federal involvement in this case. "Your Honor, perhaps the prosecution should request clarification from federal authorities regarding appropriate coordination procedures for cases involving federal security considerations." Victoria turned toward Blackwell with an expression of professional interest. "Mr. Blackwell, are you acknowledging that local prosecutorial authority requires federal guidance for proper case management in civil rights prosecutions?" The question was devastating in its implications. If local prosecutors needed federal guidance to handle civil rights cases properly, it raised fundamental questions about their competence to prosecute federal constitutional violations independently. "I'm simply noting that federal coordination ensures proper procedural compliance in complex cases," Blackwell replied defensively. "Federal coordination with which specific agencies?" Victoria asked. "I'd like to ensure that all federal entities involved in my prosecution are properly identified for constitutional notification and discovery purposes." Judge Whitmore realized that this line of questioning was exposing fundamental gaps in the court's understanding of federal involvement in Victoria's case. Neither he nor the prosecution seemed to know exactly which federal agencies were coordinating on investigation, prosecution, or security oversight. Ms. Sterling, federal agency coordination details are administrative matters that don't require defendant notification beyond constitutional minimums. Your Honor, with respect, I believe Sixth Amendment confrontation rights and Fifth Amendment due process protections require defendant awareness of all government entities involved in prosecution. Could the court specify which federal agencies have communicated regarding my case? Victoria's challenge highlighted a significant constitutional issue. If federal agencies were coordinating on her prosecution without proper disclosure, it could create due process violations that would invalidate the entire case. The bailiff approached the bench again with another folded message. Judge Whitmore read it quickly, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Ms. Sterling, I've received additional information regarding federal involvement in your case. This matter appears to involve federal law enforcement operations that require careful coordination. The words carried implications that extended far beyond routine criminal proceedings. Federal law enforcement operations that required special coordination typically involved major criminal investigations, national security considerations, or threats to federal personnel. Your Honor, Victoria said carefully, could the court specify whether these federal operations affect my right to speedy trial under the Sixth Amendment? The question demonstrated yet another dimension of Victoria's constitutional knowledge. Sixth Amendment speedy trial rights could be affected by federal law enforcement operations, but balancing constitutional protections against federal investigative needs required sophisticated understanding of constitutional criminal procedure. The week between hearings had transformed the atmosphere surrounding Victoria Sterling's case into something approaching a media sensation. Word had spread through Charleston's legal community that something extraordinary was happening in Judge Whitmore's courtroom, and the Monday morning gallery was packed with observers who typically wouldn't attend routine criminal hearings. Victoria arrived at 7:00 a.m., even earlier than the previous week, and took the same position on the bench across from courtroom C. Her routine remained identical: organized files, professional appearance, calm demeanor, but the context had changed dramatically. Court personnel who had barely noticed her the previous week now watched her movements with obvious curiosity mixed with wariness. The first escalation came from an unexpected source. As Victoria reviewed her notes, a woman in an expensive suit approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. Miss Sterling, I'm Diana Cross from Channel 7 News. Our viewers are very interested in your case involving civil rights allegations. Would you be willing to provide a statement about systematic discrimination in our federal court system? Victoria looked up from her files, her expression polite but non-committal. I prefer to let the legal proceedings speak for themselves, Ms. Cross. But surely you understand the public interest in cases involving allegations of federal constitutional violations. Our viewers have a right to know whether their justice system is protecting civil rights or violating them. The exchange was being observed by several court personnel, including bailiffs who had positioned themselves within listening distance. Victoria's response would be noted and reported, becoming part of the informal intelligence network that operated within the courthouse. The legal system provides appropriate channels for addressing constitutional concerns, Victoria replied calmly. Court filings are public documents, and judicial proceedings are open to public observation. I believe those channels serve constitutional protections effectively. Diana Cross pressed forward, clearly hoping to provoke a more substantial response that would make compelling television. But don't you think the African American community deserves to know whether federal courts are systematically discriminating against defendants of color? Shouldn't victims of judicial bias have a voice in exposing these injustices? Victoria closed her folder and looked directly at the reporter. Ms. Cross, every defendant deserves constitutional protection and due process under law. That's exactly what they should receive through proper legal channels, regardless of their race or background. The answer was professionally delivered, but carried an undertone that suggested Victoria Sterling possessed a deeper understanding of constitutional law and federal civil rights protections than most defendants could claim. Diana Cross recognized the sophistication of the response and pressed harder. Ms. Sterling, your command of constitutional terminology is quite remarkable for someone representing herself in federal court. Where exactly did you develop this expertise in federal civil rights law? The question hung in the courthouse hallway like a challenge. Other observers had stopped their conversations to listen, sensing that something significant might be revealed. Experience teaches many lessons, Ms. Cross. Some of them involve understanding how constitutional protections are supposed to function in practice. With that, Victoria gathered her materials and walked into the courtroom, leaving Diana Cross and her camera operator to make what they could of the brief exchange. The reporter's frustrated expression suggested she recognized that Victoria Sterling was far more sophisticated than she appeared, but couldn't quite identify what made her different from typical, self-representing defendants. Inside the courtroom, the dynamics had shifted noticeably. Prosecutor Harrison Blackwell arrived with 3 additional attorneys, suggesting that the district attorney's office was taking this case far more seriously than routine criminal proceedings typically warranted. Their expensive suits and coordinated movements created an atmosphere of enhanced prosecution attention that was clearly designed to intimidate. Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes appeared visibly nervous, repeatedly checking her computer screen and adjusting papers that didn't require adjustment. Her body language suggested internal conflict. She knew something that was making her uncomfortable, but her position required her to maintain the appearance of neutral professionalism. Judge Whitmore entered the courtroom with his usual dramatic flair, but his expression carried a wariness that hadn't been present the previous week. The communications from federal agencies had clearly provided information that complicated his assumptions about this case and his control over its proceedings. "Be seated," he commanded, settling into his elevated position. "We're here to continue proceedings in case number 2-4-CR-1147. Miss Sterling, I trust you've had adequate time to reconsider your decision to represent yourself in this complex federal matter." Victoria stood and approached the podium, her movement suggesting she had indeed spent considerable time in preparation, but not for reconsidering her self-representation. "Yes, Your Honor. I've reviewed all available materials and prepared additional motions for the court's consideration." Whitmore's expression darkened. More motions meant more opportunities for Victoria to demonstrate her unexplained legal sophistication, which was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable situation for a judge who preferred predictable proceedings with controllable outcomes. "Miss Sterling, this court has limited patience for dilatory tactics designed to obstruct efficient judicial administration. Proceed with your motions, but be advised that frivolous requests will not be tolerated." Victoria opened her folder and retrieved documents that appeared to be even more professionally prepared than those from the previous week. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss all charges under Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure Rule 12, subsection B, paragraph 3, subparagraph A, based on prosecutorial vindictiveness and violations of equal protection under the 14th Amendment." The words hit the courtroom like a series of explosions. Prosecutorial vindictiveness combined with equal protection violations were constitutional claims that could result not only in case dismissal, but in federal civil rights investigations of the entire prosecutorial system. Making such allegations required substantial evidence and sophisticated constitutional law expertise. Prosecutor Blackwell and his team immediately went into conference mode, whispering urgently among themselves. Their obvious alarm suggested that Victoria's allegations might have more substance than they'd anticipated. "Your Honor," Blackwell said, standing with noticeably less confidence than he'd displayed the previous week, "the prosecution objects to these inflammatory and baseless allegations. The government has followed all proper procedures in bringing charges against Miss Sterling." Victoria consulted her notes with clinical precision. "Mr. Blackwell, I have compiled comprehensive statistical evidence regarding prosecutorial charging patterns in this jurisdiction over the past 7 years. Specifically analyzing federal civil rights prosecutions based on defendant racial characteristics, socioeconomic status, and case outcomes." Judge Whitmore's face went noticeably pale. Statistical evidence of racial disparities in prosecutorial charging could support both selective enforcement claims under the Equal Protection Clause and broader federal civil rights investigations that could scrutinize his own judicial conduct. "Miss Sterling, where exactly did you obtain the expertise to conduct statistical analysis of federal prosecutorial patterns?" Victoria's response was delivered with unflappable professionalism. "Your Honor, statistical analysis methodology is publicly available through academic institutions, government agencies, and professional organizations. Federal prosecution data is accessible through Freedom of Information Act requests and Department of Justice reporting requirements. The sophistication required to conduct meaningful statistical analysis of prosecutorial patterns was far beyond what any typical defendant could accomplish." Victoria Sterling was demonstrating expertise that suggested advanced training in both legal research and quantitative analysis methods. "Your Honor," one of Blackwell's associate attorneys interjected, "even if statistical disparities exist, they don't prove prosecutorial intent to discriminate. The defense would need evidence of deliberate discriminatory motive that simply cannot be established." Victoria turned toward the prosecution table with an expression of polite interest. Counselor, are you suggesting that statistical evidence of racial disparities is insufficient to establish prima facie cases of selective enforcement? I'd be interested in your legal authority for that position, given Supreme Court precedent in Yickwo versus Hopkins, Batson versus Kentucky, and McCleskey versus Kemp. The rapid-fire citation of multiple Supreme Court cases dealing with statistical evidence of racial discrimination demonstrated yet another dimension of Victoria's legal knowledge. She was citing complex constitutional precedent that required years of legal study to understand properly. The prosecution team went into another huddle, clearly struggling to respond to constitutional arguments that exceeded their preparation level. Judge Whitmore was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the mounting evidence that Victoria Sterling possessed legal knowledge that rivaled experienced federal constitutional attorneys. "Miss Sterling," he said carefully, "this court is curious about the extent of your background in constitutional law. Your familiarity with Supreme Court precedent suggests education that goes far beyond typical self-help legal resources." Victoria paused, maintaining direct eye contact with the judge. "Your Honor, constitutional law affects every American citizen. Some individuals have greater opportunity than others to study how constitutional protections function in practice." It was another carefully crafted response that revealed nothing while highlighting the assumptions underlying the judge's questions. Victoria Sterling was maintaining operational security while demonstrating that she understood exactly what information was being sought. Can you imagine staying that calm under such blatant discrimination? The strength it takes to let them think they're winning while you're actually 3 steps ahead. If this story is making your blood boil, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to see this. The next escalation came when Bailiff Camden Pierce approached the bench with what appeared to be an urgent message. Judge Whitmore read it quickly, his expression growing visibly more alarmed. "Miss Sterling, I've just received communication from federal authorities indicating that your case involves ongoing federal law enforcement operations that require immediate security reassessment." Victoria's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained calm and professional. "Your Honor, could you specify which federal law enforcement operations are involved and how they affect my constitutional right to proceed with my defense? The specifics involve classified federal law enforcement activities that cannot be disclosed in open court proceedings." The mention of classified federal operations sent a shock through the courtroom. Classified law enforcement activities typically involved national security investigations, major federal criminal conspiracies, or threats to federal personnel that required the highest levels of security coordination. "Your Honor," Victoria said carefully, "classified federal operations that affect criminal defendants raise significant due process concerns under the Fifth Amendment. Could the court specify how classified information will be handled to ensure my constitutional rights are protected?" Judge Whitmore was clearly struggling with legal territory that extended far beyond his typical experience. Classified information procedures in criminal cases involved complex federal rules that required specialized training to navigate properly. Prosecutor Blackwell looked genuinely confused by these developments, suggesting that federal law enforcement coordination was occurring without local prosecutorial knowledge or control. His obvious lack of awareness indicated that this case had escalated beyond local authority. "Your Honor," Blackwell said uncertainly, "perhaps the prosecution should request guidance from federal authorities regarding appropriate procedural coordination in cases involving classified law enforcement operations." Victoria turned toward the prosecution table with an expression of professional interest. "Mr. Anasana, Blackwell, are you acknowledging that local prosecutorial authority is insufficient for proper case management involving federal law enforcement operations?" The question was devastating in its implications. If local prosecutors couldn't handle cases involving federal operations, it raised fundamental questions about their authority to prosecute federal civil rights violations. Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes suddenly stood up from her position, her movement abrupt enough to draw everyone's attention. "Your Honor, I've just received notification that federal authorities need to conduct immediate security screening of all courtroom personnel and case materials." Her announcement was unprecedented. Court clerks didn't interrupt proceedings to announce federal security requirements, particularly security screenings that hadn't been officially coordinated through proper judicial channels. Judge Whitmore looked at Hayes with obvious alarm. "Mrs. Hayes, security coordination procedures are determined by federal agencies in consultation with this court. Clerk announcements of security requirements are highly irregular." "Yes, Your Honor," Hayes replied, but her nervousness was unmistakable. "I simply thought the court should be aware that federal agents are requesting immediate access to all case files and personnel records related to this matter." Victoria observed this exchange with intense attention, recognizing that Magnolia Hayes was exhibiting behavior suggesting she possessed information about federal activities that extended well beyond normal court administrative functions. Your Honor, Victoria interjected, perhaps Mrs. Hayes could identify which federal agencies are requesting access to case materials? Constitutional protections might require understanding which government entities are investigating my case and why. Judge Whitmore shot Victoria a sharp look, clearly annoyed that she was inserting herself into judicial management issues. But her question highlighted a critical constitutional concern. If federal agencies were accessing case materials without proper disclosure, it could create due process violations. Ms. Sterling, federal agency coordination is an administrative matter that doesn't require defendant notification beyond constitutional requirements. Your Honor, with respect, the Sixth Amendment Confrontation Clause and Fifth Amendment Due Process Protection require defendant awareness of all government entities involved in prosecution. Hidden federal investigation could violate constitutional guarantees. Victoria's constitutional analysis was delivered with the precision of someone who understood the complex interplay between federal law enforcement operations and defendant constitutional rights. Her knowledge extended far beyond what any typical defendant could possess. The bailiff approached the bench again with another message that caused Judge Whitmore's expression to grow even more troubled. Miss Sterling, I've received additional information indicating that this case involves potential threats to federal law enforcement personnel that require enhanced security protocols. The words carried implications that extended far beyond routine criminal proceedings. Threats to federal personnel typically triggered major federal investigative responses that could involve multiple agencies and classified operations. Your Honor, Victoria said calmly, could the court specify whether these security considerations affect my right to confront witnesses under the Sixth Amendment? The question demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how federal security operations could impact constitutional trial rights. Victoria was addressing complex constitutional issues that required advanced legal training to understand properly. What if you suddenly found yourself facing false accusations or needed legal representation? Shield Legal Protection has your back. For just $29 a month, you get access to a network of experienced attorneys, 24/7 legal consultation and coverage for legal fees up to $100,000. Don't wait until you need a lawyer to find one. Shield Legal Protection members get priority access to top-rated attorneys in their area. Visit shieldlegal.com protection and use code DEFEND25 for your first month free. Because everyone deserves proper legal representation. The courtroom atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense as federal involvement escalated beyond anyone's expectations. Victoria Sterling's case had somehow evolved from a routine civil rights prosecution into something that was attracting the attention of multiple federal agencies with classified operational concerns. Prosecutor Blackwell and his team were clearly struggling to understand developments that exceeded their preparation and authority. Their whispered conferences suggested they were as confused about federal involvement as everyone else in the courtroom. Judge Whitmore was realizing that his control over these proceedings was slipping away as federal authorities asserted jurisdiction over security and investigative aspects of the case. His judicial authority was being superseded by federal operations that he didn't understand and couldn't control. Victoria Sterling remained calm and professional throughout these escalating developments, but her sophisticated legal responses and detailed constitutional knowledge were creating an increasingly obvious disparity between her supposed status as a self-representing defendant and her actual legal expertise. The lock clicks twice on her briefcase, but this time federal agents are watching from the gallery and everyone in the courtroom is beginning to understand that Victoria Sterling is not what she appears to be. The silence that follows carries the weight of revelations that are about to change everything. The recess that Judge Whitmore called lasted exactly 47 minutes. During that time, the courthouse transformed into something resembling a federal command center. U.S. Marshals in tactical gear positioned themselves at every entrance. Federal agents in dark suits conducted what they called routine security assessments of the courtroom, but their equipment suggested capabilities far beyond standard courthouse security. Victoria Sterling spent the recess in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, officially designated for defendant consultation. But the two federal agents who secured the room clearly weren't there for her protection alone. They were watching her with the intense attention of people who knew exactly who they were observing. Miss Sterling, the senior agent said, introducing himself as Deputy Marshal Williams. We understand you have concerns about security protocols affecting your constitutional rights. We want to assure you that all federal operations will comply with due process requirements. Victoria looked up from her files with an expression of polite interest. I appreciate that assurance, Deputy Marshal Williams. Could you specify which federal operations are involved in my case and which agencies are coordinating them? Williams exchanged a glance with his partner before responding carefully. Miss Sterling, we're not at liberty to discuss operational details in an unsecured environment. However, we can confirm that multiple federal agencies have taken interest in proceedings related to your case. Multiple agencies, Victoria repeated thoughtfully. That suggests my civil rights case has implications extending beyond typical federal criminal prosecution. Could you clarify whether these agencies include investigative entities or only security coordination? The question was delivered with the casual precision of someone accustomed to obtaining information from federal law enforcement personnel. Williams's response would reveal how much operational intelligence he was authorized to share. Miss Sterling, federal coordination involves both security and investigative elements as deemed necessary by appropriate authorities. Specific agency identification requires higher authorization levels. Victoria nodded professionally, but her follow-up demonstrated sophisticated understanding of federal operations. Deputy Marshal Williams, higher authorization typically refers to Department of Justice oversight or National Security Council coordination. Are you indicating that my case involves national security considerations? Williams paused, clearly weighing his response. Victoria Sterling was asking questions that suggested knowledge of federal operational structure that extended far beyond what any typical defendant should possess. Miss Sterling, we're not prepared to characterize the nature of federal interest in your case beyond security coordination requirements. I understand, Victoria replied calmly. However, federal security coordination that affects criminal proceedings requires judicial oversight to protect defendant constitutional rights. Will federal agencies be providing disclosure statements regarding their involvement for judicial review? The sophistication of her question created obvious tension between the two federal agents. Victoria was discussing federal operational disclosure requirements that most attorneys would struggle to navigate properly. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The gallery was now occupied by individuals who were clearly federal personnel, though their specific agencies and roles remained unidentified. Judge Whitmore's demeanor suggested he was no longer fully in control of his own courtroom. Miss Sterling, he began carefully, I've received additional information from federal authorities regarding security requirements for these proceedings. Apparently, your case involves ongoing federal investigations that require enhanced coordination protocols. Victoria stood at the podium with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout, but her response carried new weight given the federal presence surrounding the proceedings. Your Honor, I appreciate federal coordination, but I want to ensure that enhanced protocols include proper discovery disclosure regarding federal agency involvement in my prosecution. Constitutional protections require defendant awareness of all government entities participating in case development. Judge Whitmore glanced toward the federal agents in the gallery before responding. Miss Sterling, federal coordination disclosure will comply with constitutional requirements as determined by appropriate federal authorities. Your Honor, constitutional requirements aren't determined by federal authorities. They're mandated by the Constitution itself. Could the court specify which federal agencies have provided evidence or intelligence that contributed to my prosecution? Victoria's constitutional analysis was delivered with authority that suggested deep understanding of federal criminal procedure and constitutional law. Her question highlighted a fundamental issue. If federal agencies had contributed to her prosecution without proper disclosure, it could violate due process requirements. Prosecutor Blackwell looked increasingly uncomfortable as federal involvement escalated beyond his understanding or control. Your Honor, perhaps we could address federal coordination issues in chambers to avoid compromising sensitive law enforcement operations. Victoria turned toward Blackwell with an expression of polite but firm disagreement. Mr. Blackwell, defendant constitutional rights cannot be compromised to accommodate law enforcement convenience. Any federal coordination that affects my prosecution must be addressed on the record with proper constitutional protections. Judge Whitmore realized he was caught between federal operational requirements and constitutional mandates that he couldn't simply ignore. His next decision would determine whether these proceedings continued as criminal prosecution or transformed into something entirely different. Miss Sterling, this court will ensure constitutional compliance while coordinating with federal authorities regarding sensitive operational considerations. Federal agency disclosure will be provided as required by law. Thank you, Your Honor. Could the court specify a timeline for federal disclosure given Sixth Amendment speedy trial requirements? Victoria's question about disclosure timelines demonstrated yet another facet of her legal sophistication. Federal agency disclosure in criminal cases involved complex procedural requirements that could significantly impact trial scheduling and defendant preparation. At that moment, Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes received what appeared to be an urgent electronic communication that caused her to approach the bench immediately. The interruption was highly irregular, but her obvious distress suggested something significant had developed. "Your Honor," Hayes said quietly, "I've received notification that federal authorities have completed their preliminary assessment and need to present findings that may affect these proceedings." Judge Whitmore looked at Hayes with growing alarm. "Mrs. Hayes, what kind of findings require immediate judicial attention?" "Findings regarding case materials, evidence authentication, and," she paused, glancing toward Victoria, "defendant background verification." The words created immediate tension throughout the courtroom. Defendant background verification by federal authorities suggested that Victoria Sterling's identity or background had become subject to federal investigation. The implications were extraordinary. "Your Honor," Victoria said calmly, "if federal authorities have conducted background verification regarding my case, I request immediate disclosure of all materials developed through such investigation. Due process requires defendant access to government-developed information that affects prosecution." Judge Whitmore was clearly struggling with developments that exceeded his experience and authority. Federal background investigations of criminal defendants during ongoing prosecutions raised complex constitutional issues that required specialized legal knowledge to navigate properly. "Ms. Sterling, federal background verification procedures involve protocols that may require classified information handling. Disclosure procedures must comply with appropriate federal security requirements. Your Honor, classified information affecting criminal defendants triggers specific constitutional protections under the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Federal security requirements cannot override constitutional mandates for due process and confrontation rights." Victoria's analysis of classified information procedures in criminal cases demonstrated expertise that extended far beyond typical legal knowledge. She was addressing complex constitutional issues that required advanced federal criminal law training to understand properly. Deputy Marshal Williams approached the bench for what appeared to be an urgent consultation with Judge Whitmore. Their whispered conversation lasted several minutes and resulted in the judge's expression growing increasingly troubled. "Miss Sterling," Judge Whitmore said after the consultation, "I've been informed that federal authorities have developed information regarding your case that requires immediate judicial review in chambers. We'll recess for federal coordination. Your Honor, I respectfully request that any chambers conference include defense participation as required by due process protections. Defendant exclusion from judicial conferences regarding their own case violates fundamental constitutional guarantees." Victoria's demand for chambers conference participation highlighted another constitutional issue. Ex parte judicial communications about pending criminal cases could violate due process requirements, particularly when such communications involved federal agency coordination. Judge Whitmore was trapped between federal operational demands and constitutional requirements that he couldn't simply dismiss. "Ms. Sterling, chambers conferences involving classified federal information may require security clearance levels that affect participation. Your Honor, constitutional rights don't require security clearances. If federal information affects my prosecution, constitutional protections mandate appropriate disclosure regardless of classification levels." The exchange highlighted a fundamental tension between federal security operations and constitutional criminal procedure. Victoria was forcing the court to choose between federal operational convenience and constitutional mandates. At that moment, the main courtroom doors opened and 3 additional federal agents entered, their movement suggesting urgent coordination rather than routine security. Their arrival created immediate attention throughout the gallery and obvious concern among court personnel. The senior agent approached the bench and handed Judge Whitmore what appeared to be an official federal document. Whitmore read it quickly, his expression shifting from concern to genuine alarm. "Miss Sterling," he said carefully, "I've just received federal authorization that requires immediate implementation of enhanced security protocols for these proceedings. All participants must undergo federal security screening before proceedings can continue." Victoria's response was immediate and professionally delivered. "Your Honor, federal security screening of criminal defendants raises significant constitutional concerns. Could the court specify which federal authority authorized security screening and under what legal justification?" "Ms. Sterling, federal security screening is authorized under federal law enforcement coordination statutes that protect ongoing investigations and personnel safety. Your Honor, I'm not familiar with federal statutes that authorize security screening of criminal defendants during ongoing proceedings without specific probable cause or warrant requirements. Could the court cite the specific federal authority being invoked? Victoria's challenge was constitutionally grounded and highlighted a critical issue. If federal authorities were imposing security requirements without proper legal justification, it could violate Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. Judge Whitmore consulted the federal document again before responding. Ms. Sterling, federal authority derives from ongoing law enforcement operations that involve the potential threats to federal personnel and operations. Your Honor, potential threats require specific factual basis under Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. Generalized security concerns cannot justify constitutional violations. Could the court specify what threats have been identified that justify security screening? Victoria's Fourth Amendment analysis demonstrated constitutional law expertise that rivaled experienced federal criminal defense attorneys. She was forcing the court to justify federal actions under specific constitutional standards. The federal agents in the gallery were observing this exchange with obvious attention. Victoria Sterling was challenging federal authority with constitutional arguments that suggested legal knowledge far exceeding reasonable expectations for any typical defendant. The evidence she's about to present will shock everyone in that courtroom. The judge thinks he knows who he's dealing with, but he's about to get the surprise of his career. Drop a comment below. What do you think her real identity is? The reveal is coming. Prosecutor Blackwell finally stood up, clearly recognizing that federal involvement had escalated beyond local prosecutorial authority. Your Honor, perhaps the prosecution should request federal guidance regarding appropriate coordination procedures for cases involving multiple federal agencies. Victoria turned toward the prosecution table with an expression of professional interest. Mr. Blackwell, are you acknowledging that multiple federal agencies are involved in my prosecution? Could you identify which agencies have participated in case development? The question forced Blackwell to reveal information about federal coordination that he clearly hadn't intended to disclose. His obvious discomfort suggested he possessed limited knowledge about the full scope of federal involvement. The prosecution is coordinating with appropriate federal entities as required by federal civil rights prosecution protocols. Which specific entities, Mr. Blackwell? Constitutional disclosure requires identification of all government agencies participating in prosecution development. Blackwell glanced toward Judge Whitmore, seeking judicial rescue from questions he couldn't answer confidently. Your Honor, federal coordination details may involve sensitive law enforcement operations that require appropriate security protocols. Victoria's response was swift and constitutionally grounded. Mr. Blackwell, sensitive law enforcement operations cannot justify constitutional violations. Defendant rights to confrontation and due process require identification of all prosecution participants regardless of operational sensitivity. The exchange highlighted fundamental constitutional principles that couldn't be compromised for federal operational convenience. Victoria was forcing both the prosecution and the court to choose between federal coordination and constitutional compliance. At that moment, Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes stood up abruptly from her position, her movement drawing immediate attention from everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying obvious distress, I need to make a disclosure regarding my communications with federal authorities. The announcement sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Court clerks weren't supposed to have independent communications with federal authorities about pending cases, particularly communications that required disclosure during proceedings. Judge Whitmore looked at Hayes with obvious alarm. Mrs. Hayes, what kind of communications require disclosure? Hayes glanced toward Victoria before responding. Your Honor, I've been providing federal authorities with information about case procedures, document filings, and participant activities. The revelation was devastating. If the court clerk had been providing federal authorities with information about defense activities, attorney-client communications, or case strategy, it could constitute a massive violation of constitutional protections. Ms. Hayes, Victoria said quietly, are you indicating that you've been conducting surveillance of defense activities for federal authorities? Hayes nodded reluctantly. I've been reporting procedural activities and document reviews as requested by federal coordination requirements. Victoria's response was delivered with calm professionalism, but its implications were explosive. Your Honor, court clerk surveillance of defense activities violates multiple constitutional protections, including Fourth Amendment privacy rights, Fifth Amendment due process protections, and Sixth Amendment rights to effective assistance of counsel. Judge Whitmore was clearly struggling with revelations that exposed fundamental constitutional violations in his own courtroom. Court clerk surveillance of criminal defendants created due process problems that could invalidate entire prosecutions. Ms. Sterling, court administrative activities are within judicial oversight and federal coordination requirements. Your Honor, constitutional rights cannot be compromised by administrative convenience or federal coordination. Court clerk surveillance of criminal defendants requires specific warrant authorization and judicial oversight. Victoria's constitutional analysis was forcing the court to confront serious legal violations that had occurred under judicial supervision. The implications extended far beyond her individual case. Interested in understanding your legal rights better? Law Scholar Academy offers comprehensive online courses taught by practicing attorneys and federal judges. From constitutional law to civil rights, their interactive modules help you understand the legal system that affects your daily life. Over 50,000 students have already enrolled in their acclaimed Know Your Rights certification program. Visit lawscholaracademy.com and use code KNOWLEDGE15 for 15% off any course. Because legal knowledge is power and everyone deserves to understand the law. The federal agents in the gallery had become noticeably more active, engaging in whispered communications and electronic coordination that suggested rapid operational development. Victoria observed their activities with the trained attention of someone accustomed to federal law enforcement operations. Deputy Marshal Williams approached the bench again with what appeared to be another urgent communication. Judge Whitmore read it quickly, his expression suggesting that federal coordination had reached a critical decision point. Ms. Sterling, he announced, I've received federal authorization to proceed with enhanced security protocols that require immediate implementation. All participants must undergo federal background verification before proceedings can continue. Victoria's response was immediate and constitutionally precise. Your Honor, federal background verification during ongoing criminal proceedings violates due process protections unless justified by specific probable cause and warrant requirements. Could the court specify the factual basis for federal background investigation? Ms. Sterling, federal background verification is authorized by ongoing law enforcement operations that involve national security considerations. Your Honor, national security considerations cannot justify constitutional violations without specific factual predicates and judicial oversight. Could the court identify what national security threats have been established that justify background investigation? Victoria's national security analysis demonstrated yet another dimension of her legal sophistication. She was addressing complex constitutional issues involving national security and criminal procedure that required specialized federal law expertise. The tension in the courtroom was becoming overwhelming as federal authority collided with constitutional protections in ways that exceeded everyone's preparation except Victoria's. Her legal knowledge and constitutional analysis were exposing fundamental flaws in federal coordination that suggested systematic violations of defendant rights. Judge Whitmore realized that his next decision would determine whether these proceedings continued as criminal prosecution or transformed into a federal constitutional crisis that could attract national attention and judicial oversight. Ms. Sterling, this court will implement federal security requirements while ensuring appropriate constitutional protections. Background verification will proceed under proper judicial oversight. Thank you, Your Honor. I assume judicial oversight includes defendant access to all background investigation materials as required by Brady v. Maryland and constitutional due process protections. Victoria's citation of Brady doctrine in the context of federal background investigations demonstrated expertise that suggested professional training in federal criminal law and constitutional procedure. Her knowledge was too sophisticated, too precise for any typical defendant. The lock clicks twice on her briefcase, but this time the sound carries different weight. Federal agents are watching. Court personnel are nervous. And everyone in the courtroom is beginning to understand that Victoria Sterling possesses knowledge and capabilities that extend far beyond anything reasonable for a self-representing defendant. The silence that follows carries the weight of revelations that are about to change everything everyone thought they knew about this case. The federal background verification process that Judge Whitmore authorized took exactly 18 minutes to complete. During that time, the courtroom was transformed into what essentially became a federal command center, with agents conducting electronic sweeps, security assessments, and coordination activities that extended far beyond routine courthouse security. Victoria Sterling underwent the federal background verification with the calm cooperation of someone who knew exactly what the process would reveal. As federal agents confirmed her identity through multiple databases and security clearances, she maintained the same professional demeanor she'd displayed throughout the proceedings, but with a subtle shift that suggested she was preparing for a fundamental change in the courtroom dynamics. When proceedings resumed, Deputy Marshal Williams positioned himself directly behind the prosecution table, while 2 additional federal agents flanked the gallery. The message was clear. Federal authority now superseded local judicial control over these proceedings. Miss Sterling, Judge Whitmore began carefully, federal background verification has been completed. However, the results have raised additional questions that require immediate judicial attention. Victoria stood at the podium with her briefcase and organized files, but something in her posture had changed. The careful deference of a defendant was being replaced by something else entirely, the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to maintain a cover identity. Your Honor, I assume federal background verification has provided information that affects these proceedings. Could the court specify what questions have been raised? Judge Whitmore consulted a federal document that had been provided by Deputy Marshal Williams. Miss Sterling, federal authorities have identified discrepancies regarding your background information that require clarification before proceedings can continue. What kind of discrepancies, Your Honor? Discrepancies regarding your educational background, professional experience, and current employment status. The words hung in the courtroom air like smoke from an explosion. Federal background verification had apparently revealed that Victoria Sterling was not what she appeared to be, and Judge Whitmore was struggling with information that contradicted everything he'd assumed about the defendant standing before him. Your Honor, Victoria said calmly, perhaps it would be helpful if I clarified my background for the record. She reached into her briefcase and retrieved a leather credential case that she'd kept carefully secured throughout the proceedings. Her movements were deliberate and professional, suggesting she was finally prepared to reveal information she'd been protecting. Miss Sterling, Judge Whitmore said cautiously, before you make any statements regarding your background, this court advises you of your right to consult with counsel regarding any disclosures that might affect your legal status. Victoria looked directly at the judge with an expression that had shifted from defendant deference to something approaching professional authority. Your Honor, I appreciate the court's concern for my rights, but I believe it's time to provide complete information regarding my actual status and the nature of these proceedings. She opened the credential case and removed a gold badge and official identification that she placed on the podium facing the court. The federal agents in the gallery immediately straightened, recognizing the significance of what was being revealed. Your Honor, my name is Special Agent Victoria Sterling, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit. I've been operating undercover for the past 6 months investigating systematic civil rights violations and federal corruption in this jurisdiction. The courtroom erupted. Gallery observers gasped audibly. Prosecutor Blackwell dropped his pen. Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes put her head in her hands. Judge Whitmore stared at the FBI credentials on his podium as if they might disappear if he looked at them long enough. What? Whitmore's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. What did you say? Victoria's voice carried the authority of someone who no longer needed to disguise her true identity. I am FBI Special Agent Victoria Sterling. Everything that has occurred in this courtroom over the past 2 weeks has been part of Operation Clean Slate, a federal investigation into systematic civil rights violations, judicial corruption, and prosecutorial misconduct in the Charleston County federal judicial system. Deputy Marshal Williams stepped forward and confirmed Victoria's identity. Your Honor, Agent Sterling's credentials have been verified through FBI headquarters. Her undercover operation has been authorized by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the FBI Director's Office. Judge Whitmore looked around his courtroom as if seeing it for the first time. The federal agents, the enhanced security protocols, the sophisticated legal arguments. Everything suddenly made sense in a way that was terrifying for someone who had spent years believing his authority was unquestionable. This is impossible, he stammered. You're a defendant. You're charged with federal civil rights violations. Agent Sterling, no longer Victoria the defendant, picked up her credentials and badge, replacing them in her official FBI credential case. Your Honor, the charges against Victoria Sterling were fabricated as part of the undercover operation. There is no defendant named Victoria Sterling facing civil rights violations. There is only FBI Special Agent Victoria Sterling who has spent 6 months documenting systematic constitutional violations in your courtroom. Prosecutor Blackwell finally found his voice, though it came out strained and desperate. Your Honor, there must be some mistake. The charges were filed through proper channels. We have evidence, documentation. Agent Sterling turned toward the prosecution table with an expression that was no longer deferential but professionally authoritative. Mr. Blackwell, the evidence you've been provided was created by federal authorities as part of the undercover operation. Every document, every piece of physical evidence, Every witness statement was fabricated to create a believable federal civil rights case that would allow this operation to proceed. The implications were staggering. If the FBI had created an entire fabricated federal criminal case complete with evidence and documentation, it meant that federal authorities had been planning this investigation for months and had the resources to construct elaborate undercover operations targeting judicial corruption. Judge Whitmore was struggling to process revelations that undermined everything he'd believed about his control over his own courtroom. Agent Sterling, this court has been conducting legitimate federal criminal proceedings. If you've been operating undercover, where is the actual defendant? What happened to the real criminal case? Agent Sterling consulted her notes. No longer the desperate preparation of a self-representing defendant, but the organized intelligence of a federal law enforcement officer. Your Honor, there was never a real criminal case. Operation Clean Slate was designed specifically to investigate your courtroom, your judicial conduct, and your relationship with local prosecutors regarding systematic civil rights violations. My judicial conduct? Whitmore's voice carried a note of outrage mixed with fear. I've been conducting legitimate federal proceedings according to proper legal standards. Your Honor, Operation Clean Slate has documented extensive evidence of racial bias in judicial decision-making, selective enforcement of procedural rules based on defendant characteristics, and coordinated efforts with local prosecutors to maximize convictions and sentences for minority defendants. Agent Sterling reached into her briefcase and retrieved a thick folder that contained what appeared to be extensive documentation. Over the past 6 months, this investigation has recorded over 40 hours of courtroom proceedings, documented 17 instances of procedural bias based on defendant race, and identified systematic patterns of constitutional violations that have affected hundreds of criminal defendants. The folder she presented appeared to contain transcripts, audio recordings, video documentation, and statistical analyses that represented a comprehensive federal investigation into judicial misconduct. The scope of evidence suggested that Operation Clean Slate had involved significant federal resources and sophisticated investigation techniques. 17 instances? Judge Whitmore's voice was becoming increasingly desperate. Agent Sterling, judicial decision-making involves complex legal analysis that requires consideration of multiple factors. Isolated incidents cannot establish patterns of misconduct. Your Honor, federal civil rights investigations rely on statistical analysis and pattern documentation to establish systematic constitutional violations. 17 documented instances over 6 months, combined with statistical evidence of racial disparities in sentencing and procedural decisions, constitutes substantial evidence of civil rights violations as under federal law. Agent Sterling's analysis was delivered with the authority of someone who had conducted extensive federal civil rights investigations. Her statistical methodology and legal framework demonstrated expertise that explained her sophisticated courtroom performance over the preceding weeks. Prosecutor Blackwell was looking around the courtroom as if seeking an exit that would allow him to escape the developing federal investigation. Your Honor, if Agent Sterling has been conducting an undercover operation, perhaps we should request federal guidance regarding appropriate procedural coordination. Agent Sterling turned toward Blackwell with professional authority that no longer needed to be disguised. Mr. Blackwell, you don't need to request federal guidance. You're currently the subject of a federal investigation into prosecutorial misconduct, selective enforcement, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. The words hit Blackwell like physical blows. Federal investigations into prosecutorial misconduct could result in criminal charges, disbarment, and federal prosecution under civil rights statutes that carried significant penalties. Conspiracy? Blackwell's voice came out as a croak. I've been conducting legitimate prosecutions according to established procedures. Mr. Blackwell, Operation Clean Slate has documented extensive coordination between your office and Judge Whitmore's court regarding case assignments, sentencing recommendations, and procedural decisions that demonstrate systematic bias against minority defendants. Agent Sterling retrieved another folder from her briefcase, this one containing what appeared to be communication records and coordination documentation. Federal investigators have recorded telephone conversations, electronic communications, and meeting transcripts that document deliberate coordination to maximize convictions and sentences for African American and Hispanic defendants, while providing more lenient treatment for white defendants charged with similar offenses. The documentation she referenced suggested that federal authorities had been conducting sophisticated electronic surveillance of both judicial and prosecutorial communications, indicating that Operation Clean Slate involved federal investigative techniques typically reserved for major criminal conspiracies. Judge Whitmore was staring at Agent Sterling with the expression of someone watching his entire career collapse in real time. Agent Sterling, if federal authorities suspected judicial misconduct, proper procedure required notification through appropriate judicial channels. Undercover operations targeting federal judges require specific authorization. Agent Sterling's response demonstrated the federal authority that had been hidden throughout her undercover operation. Your Honor, Operation Clean Slate was authorized by the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, approved by the FBI Director, and coordinated with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. All federal oversight procedures were followed according to established protocols for judicial corruption investigations. The revelation that Operation Clean Slate had received authorization from the highest levels of federal law enforcement meant that Judge Whitmore's courthouse had been under federal investigation for months with the knowledge and approval of federal judicial oversight authorities. The Administrative Office knows about this? Whitmore's voice carried genuine panic. The Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts provided oversight for federal judicial conduct, and their involvement in corruption investigations typically resulted in immediate judicial suspension and criminal referrals. Your Honor, the Administrative Office has been briefed on Operation Clean Slate findings and will be receiving comprehensive reports regarding systematic constitutional violations documented in your courtroom. Federal judicial oversight authorities are prepared to take immediate action based on investigation results. Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes, who had been sitting in stunned silence since Agent Sterling's identity revelation, suddenly stood up with obvious distress. "Agent Sterling," she said, her voice carrying obvious guilt and fear, "I need to make a statement regarding my cooperation with federal authorities." Agent Sterling turned toward Hayes with professional attention. "Mrs. Hayes, you have the right to remain silent and consult with counsel before making any statements. However, federal authorities appreciate cooperation from individuals who have been coerced into participating in corrupt activities." Hayes looked around the courtroom before continuing. "I've been providing information to federal investigators for the past 4 months after they approached me with evidence of systematic misconduct in this court. I was told that my cooperation could help protect other victims of judicial bias." The revelation that Court Clerk Hayes had been a federal informant explained her nervous behavior and knowledge of federal activities throughout the proceedings. Her cooperation with federal authorities had provided inside access to judicial communications and procedural irregularities. Judge Whitmore looked at his court clerk with an expression of complete betrayal. "Magnolia, you've been spying for federal investigators?" "Your Honor," Hayes replied, her voice shaking, "federal agents showed me statistical evidence of racial disparities in your sentencing decisions and prosecutorial coordination that violated constitutional protections. They convinced me that cooperation was necessary to protect future defendants from civil rights violations." Agent Sterling consulted her organized files with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this revelation for months. "Mrs. Hayes has provided valuable intelligence regarding judicial prosecutorial coordination, case assignment irregularities, and communication patterns that demonstrate systematic constitutional violations. Her cooperation has been essential to Operation Clean Slate documentation." The scope of federal investigation was becoming clear. Operation Clean Slate had involved multiple federal informants, electronic surveillance, statistical analysis, and months of sophisticated intelligence gathering designed to document systematic civil rights violations in the Charleston County federal judicial system. Deputy Marshal Williams stepped forward with what appeared to be official federal documentation. "Your Honor, I have federal warrants for the arrest of Judge Thaddeus Whitmore and Prosecutor Harrison Blackwell on charges of conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law, violation of civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and honest services fraud under federal corruption statutes." The words echoed through the courtroom like gunshots. Federal arrest warrants for a sitting federal judge and federal prosecutor represented one of the most serious federal law enforcement actions possible against judicial system officials. Judge Whitmore stared at the federal documentation as if it might change if he looked at it differently. "This is impossible. Federal judges cannot be arrested during judicial proceedings. There are procedural protections, administrative channels." Agent Sterling's response carried the authority of federal law enforcement that had been hidden throughout her undercover operation. "Your Honor, federal arrest warrants supersede judicial immunity when federal corruption crimes are involved. Administrative channels were exhausted through 6 months of investigation and documentation that established probable cause for federal criminal charges." Deputy Marshal Williams approached the bench with the federal warrants and handcuffs that represented the complete collapse of local judicial authority. "Judge Whitmore, please step down from the bench. You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law." The sight of a federal judge being arrested in his own courtroom created chaos throughout the gallery. Reporters scrambled for their phones and cameras. Attorney observers sat in stunned silence. Court personnel looked around uncertainly, unsure of their responsibilities when federal authority superseded all local control. Prosecutor Blackwell made a desperate attempt to assert some remaining authority. "Your Honor, Agent Sterling, this is a federal courthouse operating under established judicial procedures. Federal investigations must follow proper channels that respect judicial independence and prosecutorial authority." Agent Sterling turned toward Blackwell with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to hide her federal authority. "Mr. Blackwell, judicial independence and prosecutorial authority cannot be used to shield federal criminal activity. Operation Clean Slate has documented extensive evidence of systematic civil rights violations that constitute federal crimes." Deputy Marshal Williams handcuffed Judge Whitmore, who appeared to be in shock as he was removed from the elevated bench where he had exercised unquestioned authority for over 2 decades. The image of a federal judge in handcuffs represented a complete reversal of courthouse power dynamics. "Harrison Blackwell," Williams announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law and honest services fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As Blackwell was handcuffed and read his Miranda rights, the transformation of the courtroom was complete. Federal authority had replaced local judicial control, and the systematic corruption that had operated for years was finally being exposed through federal law enforcement action. Agent Sterling gathered her files and federal documentation, her movements now displaying the professional efficiency of an experienced FBI agent rather than the careful preparation of a defendant. Her undercover operation had achieved its objectives through months of patient intelligence gathering and legal expertise that had fooled everyone involved. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the gallery, "Operation Clean Slate will continue investigating systematic civil rights violations throughout the federal judicial system in this region. Additional arrests and federal charges are anticipated as the investigation proceeds." The revelation that Operation Clean Slate extended beyond individual arrests to systematic investigation of regional federal judicial corruption meant that this was only the beginning of a comprehensive federal law enforcement response to documented constitutional violations. As federal agents escorted Judge Whitmore and Prosecutor Blackwell from the courtroom, Agent Sterling approached the podium where she had spent weeks defending fabricated charges while documenting real federal crimes. Her undercover operation had succeeded in exposing corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. The lock clicks twice on her briefcase, but now everyone understands that the sound represents not desperate defendant preparation, but the organized efficiency of a federal law enforcement officer who has successfully completed one of the most sophisticated undercover operations in federal judicial history. This kind of systematic corruption happens more than you think. We have another story about a dirty cop who thought he could frame an innocent person until he discovered who he was really messing with. Subscribe now so you don't miss that incredible story of justice. The federal courthouse that had operated for decades under Judge Whitmore's authority was transformed within hours of Operation Clean Slate's revelation. FBI agents secured all court records, electronic systems, and case files for comprehensive review. U.S. Marshals established federal oversight protocols that would remain in place until the Department of Justice could assess the full scope of corruption and implement corrective measures. Agent Victoria Sterling, no longer constrained by her undercover identity, conducted a press conference on the courthouse steps where Judge Whitmore had once exercised unquestioned authority over federal criminal proceedings. Operation Clean Slate represents a comprehensive federal response to systematic civil rights violations that have affected hundreds of criminal defendants over multiple years, she announced to assembled media representatives who had gathered to cover what was being called the largest federal judicial corruption investigation in South Carolina history. "Our investigation documented extensive evidence of racial bias in sentencing, procedural discrimination based on defendant characteristics, and coordinated efforts between judicial and prosecutorial officials to maximize convictions and sentences for minority defendants while providing more lenient treatment for white defendants charged with similar federal offenses." The statistical evidence that Agent Sterling referenced had been compiled through sophisticated federal analysis of court records, sentencing data, and procedural decisions spanning Judge Whitmore's entire judicial tenure. The scope of documentation suggested that federal authorities had been planning this investigation for considerably longer than the 6 months of active undercover operation. Federal charges have been filed against Judge Thaddeus Whitmore and Prosecutor Harrison Blackwell under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, and federal corruption statutes. Additional federal charges against other officials are anticipated as the investigation proceeds. The revelation that additional charges were anticipated meant that Operation Clean Slate had identified corruption extending beyond the immediate arrest to include other judicial system personnel who had participated in systematic constitutional violations. Diana Cross, the Channel 7 reporter who had attempted to interview Victoria during her undercover operation, raised her hand for questions. "Agent Sterling, how many criminal defendants were affected by the corruption you documented?" "Our preliminary analysis indicates that systematic bias affected approximately 437 federal criminal cases processed through Judge Whitmore's court over the past 7 years. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division will review every case for potential constitutional violations that could result in conviction reversals, sentence reductions, or complete case dismissals." The number of potentially affected cases represented a staggering scope of federal judicial misconduct that could result in one of the largest federal conviction review processes in recent history. Hundreds of individuals who had been sentenced under biased proceedings would potentially receive federal relief. What specific evidence did Operation Clean Slate develop regarding systematic bias? Another reporter asked. Agent Sterling consulted her federal documentation with the professional efficiency she had displayed throughout her undercover operation. Federal investigation documented 17 specific instances of procedural bias based on defendant race. Statistical evidence showing that African American defendants received sentences averaging 37% longer than white defendants for identical federal charges, and recorded communications between Judge Whitmore and Prosecutor Blackwell coordinating case assignments and sentencing recommendations based on defendant racial characteristics. The statistical evidence of sentencing disparities provided concrete documentation of constitutional violations that would support not only criminal prosecutions, but also federal civil rights lawsuits against the judicial system itself. Will there be additional arrests beyond Judge Whitmore and Prosecutor Blackwell? Operation Clean Slate identified a network of judicial system personnel who participated in or facilitated systematic constitutional violations. Federal investigations are ongoing regarding additional officials who may face federal charges for civil rights violations or corruption offenses. The reference to a network of corrupt officials suggested that Operation Clean Slate had uncovered institutional corruption extending throughout the local federal judicial system rather than isolated misconduct by individual officials. What happens to the defendants who were sentenced under biased proceedings? Agent Sterling's response demonstrated the comprehensive federal response that Operation Clean Slate had triggered. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division has established a federal case review task force that will examine every criminal case processed through Judge Whitmore's court for evidence of constitutional violations. Defendants who were affected by biased proceedings will receive appropriate federal relief, including conviction reversals, sentence modifications, or complete case dismissals as warranted by evidence of constitutional violations. The Federal Case Review Task Force represented unprecedented federal intervention in local judicial proceedings, with resources and authority to overturn years of potentially corrupted federal criminal prosecutions. In the weeks that followed Agent Sterling's revelation, the Charleston County federal judicial system underwent complete federal restructuring. The Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts appointed a federal monitor with authority to oversee all court operations until systematic reforms could be implemented and verified. Judge Whitmore's bail hearing, conducted before a federal judge from the District of Columbia to avoid local conflicts of interest, resulted in his release on $500,000 bond with electronic monitoring and travel restrictions. His federal corruption trial was scheduled for the following year, with proceedings that would likely attract national attention to federal judicial corruption. Prosecutor Blackwell's professional situation deteriorated rapidly as state bar associations in both South Carolina and federal jurisdictions initiated disciplinary proceedings that would likely result in permanent disbarment. His federal corruption trial was consolidated with Judge Whitmore's prosecution to expedite federal judicial processing. The Federal Case Review Task Force began systematic examination of federal criminal cases with remarkable results. Within 3 months, 47 convictions were overturned due to documented evidence of procedural bias. 63 defendants received sentence reductions averaging 4 years per case. 12 federal cases were dismissed entirely after federal review determined that prosecutorial misconduct had compromised constitutional protections. The financial impact on the federal judicial system was substantial. The Department of Justice established a federal compensation fund with initial authorization of $50 million to provide financial relief to defendants who had been wrongfully convicted or sentenced under biased proceedings. Civil rights attorneys throughout the region filed federal lawsuits seeking additional compensation for constitutional violations that would likely result in settlement payments exceeding $100 million. Court Clerk Magnolia Hayes, whose cooperation with federal authorities had been essential to Operation Clean Slate's success, received federal witness protection and immunity from prosecution in exchange for her continued cooperation with ongoing federal investigations. Her testimony would be crucial to prosecuting the network of corruption that had operated throughout the local federal judicial system. Agent Sterling was reassigned to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit headquarters in Washington, D.C., where her expertise in undercover judicial investigations would be applied to similar operations in other federal jurisdictions. The success of Operation Clean Slate had demonstrated the effectiveness of sophisticated undercover operations targeting systematic judicial corruption. The media coverage of Operation Clean Slate's revelations extended far beyond local or regional interest. National news organizations covered the investigation as evidence of broader problems within federal judicial systems that required systematic reform and enhanced oversight. However, the resolution of immediate corruption charges did not address the underlying systemic issues that had allowed such extensive misconduct to operate undetected for years. Federal authorities acknowledged that Operation Clean Slate represented only preliminary steps toward comprehensive judicial reform. 6 months after Agent Sterling's dramatic revelation, the long-term implications of Operation Clean Slate remained complex and unresolved. Judge Whitmore's replacement, appointed through emergency federal procedures, implemented enhanced procedural protections designed to prevent future bias. But systematic change required institutional modifications that would take years to complete. The federal monitoring protocols established in Charleston County were expanded to other federal jurisdictions where statistical analysis had identified similar patterns of potential bias in judicial proceedings. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division initiated what it called systematic judicial review procedures designed to identify and address constitutional violations before they could affect hundreds of criminal defendants. Agent Sterling's undercover operation had succeeded in exposing and prosecuting specific instances of corruption. But the broader questions raised by Operation Clean Slate regarding federal judicial oversight, systemic bias, and constitutional protection enforcement remain subjects of ongoing federal policy development. The courthouse steps where Agent Sterling had announced Operation Clean Slate's success became a symbol of federal commitment to constitutional protection, but also a reminder of how extensive corruption could operate within supposedly secure federal institutions. As federal investigations continued and systematic reforms were implemented, the long-term effectiveness of Operation Clean Slate would be measured not only by individual prosecutions, but by the broader institutional changes needed to prevent future constitutional violations. The transformation of Charleston County's federal judicial system demonstrated both the potential for federal law enforcement to address systematic corruption and the complex challenges involved in reforming institutions that had operated under corrupt practices for extended periods. But Operation Clean Slate had generated intelligence that extended far beyond Charleston County's federal courthouse. Agent Sterling's investigation had identified communication patterns, coordination networks, and systematic practices that suggested similar corruption in other federal jurisdictions throughout the Southeast region. 3 weeks after Judge Whitmore's arrest, Agent Sterling received a secure communication at FBI headquarters that would define her next assignment. The message was marked with federal classification levels that indicated national security implications extending beyond routine corruption investigations. The communication originated from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division's Special Investigations Unit, a department that most FBI agents never knew existed. The message was brief but carried extraordinary implications. Operation Clean Slate Phase 2 authorized. Regional systematic corruption confirmed. Federal judicial network identified. Report to classified briefing facility immediately. Agent Sterling realized that her 6 months undercover in Charleston County had uncovered only the beginning of a federal corruption network that extended far beyond individual judges and prosecutors to include systematic coordination among federal officials throughout multiple states. The classified briefing materials revealed that Operation Clean Slate's success had triggered federal intelligence analysis identifying coordination patterns among federal judges, prosecutors, and court personnel across 7 southeastern states. Electronic surveillance and financial analysis had documented systematic corruption involving private prison corporations, judicial sentencing quotas, and coordinated efforts to maximize federal incarceration rates for minority defendants. The scope of systematic corruption suggested that Operation Clean Slate had exposed a regional network of federal officials who had been coordinating to violate constitutional rights on a scale that threatened the integrity of the entire federal judicial system in the Southeast. Agent Sterling's next assignment would involve coordinating multiple undercover operations across 7 states, with federal resources and authority that dwarfed even the sophisticated Operation Clean Slate investigation. The network she had uncovered would require federal law enforcement response involving hundreds of agents and potentially years of investigation. But as Agent Sterling prepared for Phase 2 operations, she discovered intelligence that raised even more disturbing questions about the scope of federal corruption. Electronic communications intercepted during Operation Clean Slate had referenced coordination with federal officials at levels that extended far beyond regional jurisdiction. The final piece of intelligence that would define Operation Clean Slate Phase 2 involved encrypted communications that mentioned federal oversight coordination and national policy implementation, in contexts that suggested systematic corruption extended beyond regional networks to include federal authorities at the highest levels of government. Agent Sterling's investigation had begun with documentation of bias in a single federal courtroom. It had expanded to expose regional corruption affecting hundreds of criminal defendants. Now it was evolving into something that could potentially implicate federal officials at levels that would threaten the constitutional foundations of the federal judicial system itself. The locked briefcase that Agent Sterling carried as she prepared for Phase 2 operations contained intelligence that would determine whether Operation Clean Slate represented the end of regional corruption or the beginning of revelations that could reshape federal law enforcement and constitutional protection throughout the United States. The silence that followed her footsteps through FBI headquarters carried the weight of secrets that would define the future of federal justice in America. But that story would have to wait for another day, when the full scope of what Agent Victoria Sterling had uncovered could finally be revealed to a nation that desperately needed to understand how deep federal corruption had penetrated into the institutions designed to protect constitutional rights. The lock clicks twice on her briefcase one final time, but now the sound carries the promise of justice that extends far beyond Charleston County to constitutional protections that affect every American citizen.